Was there anything that changed in the way that you fly or operate that you learned from the other team? They say, hey, that's a better way of doing it. Let's tweak here or there. Was there anything that came out of this process?
Oh boy, did it ever. Rain, how far do you want me to go with this? I can talk for 5 straight minutes on that question alone.
Well, I think it's good. I mean, because it's one thing if you're the premier demonstration team, right? And you're operating at that level, it is tough, I think, for a lot of people sometimes, like, I don't need to learn anything else. But that's the thing at fighter pilots, right? Like, you're always striving to be better. And I think the humility part is a key piece, but not an easy thing to do when, again, you're wearing a blue flight suit and you guys have been right? Like, don't need to take anything from anyone else. So I think people would be interested to hear just the fact of, what influenced one another.
Okay. Well, it was a lot. I'm gonna take you guys on a bit of a historic journey here through the Thunderbirds. And then we can go a lot deeper on this as we get into the podcast. But just to kind of give you a big picture overview of where we were at before this interaction started between the Blues and the Thunderbirds. Thunderbirds were in a pretty tough period in history. You go back to just prior to the pandemic, back to 2018, 2019 timeframe, and look at a snapshot in Thunderbird history. Here's what you see. You had a fatal accident that killed Cajun. You had 3 Class A mishaps within a very short period of time. You had a commander leader fired, and you had a demonstration that was poor enough, frankly, that to this day, we're trying to get rid of some of the pictures on Google of our Diamond Pass and Review, which was supposed to be our elite formation maneuver that demonstrates the ultimate precision flying that the U.S. Air Force is capable of. And Paco and Rain, I'll send you that photo just so you've got it, because I think it's worth showing people that sometimes it's difficult to see culture drift in an organization, and sometimes it is not. Sometimes it's right there, visibly right in front of you. The way things were being flown were just incorrect. And, it had drifted to a point culturally where the Thunderbirds had anchored on the, hey, we make a lot of noise, we bring a lot of thrust and oomph and scare the crowd, and that's our demonstration. And it doesn't matter that much anyway, because people have a hard time telling the difference in precision and non-precision. And it's really about the outreach and the, getting that good social media presence out there. That had drifted. That was a prevailing thought process on the team if you go back just a few short years. There's a whole deeper history on how we got there, and I'm happy to talk about it as we dive in. But what I'll get at to answer your question directly is, for the Blues, these two teams over 70, 75 years go through cultural waves. Both of them go through cultural waves. I have no doubt about that. And when we started interacting with the Blues in the America Strong campaign and bringing the teams closer together, what we learned is they were actually at a cultural high point, and their demo was extremely precise. And so we relearned a lot of the things that the Thunderbirds used to do. If you go back to the 90s and 80s, flying the exact same jet, by the way, we relearned a lot of that stuff from the Blue Angels. And it was kind of a confirmation that some of the things the alumni were telling us to tighten back down on, in fact, were still possible. And we learned that from interactions with these guys and learning how to fly the Diamond Pass and Review again, the way it should be flown, for example. And then that rippled into a whole lot of other stuff. So enormous changes from the interaction.
It's interesting that you bring that up about the cultural waves. There's highs and lows. And so if you go back to like why the Air Force started flying the F-16, there's a whole history behind that. So the Thunderbirds took the F-16 over in 83, but from about 1974 to 1983, they were actually flying the T-38,
Correct.
A trainer.
That's correct.
And so they shifted away from flying combat aircraft to trainer aircraft for a few reasons. One of them, the economics of fuel during the oil crisis, but that itself started creating this cultural problem that had manifested over years and years and years. And the Thunderbirds killed 5 pilots within like a 1-year time frame. One of them was a tragic mishap where 4 died in one event. And then the commander of the Thunderbird crashed and he died. So they canceled the season, they canceled everything, and they kind of rebuilt the Thunderbirds culturally, technologically. They shifted to the F-16. And Ash, this is your baby. You probably tell a story better than me, but what you just said reminds me a lot of how like those people 30 years ago had some of the same challenges and how they kind of went through to like rebuild what peak performance looks like in a high performing team. So you guys see any parallels from kind of 30 years ago from then and now?
Oh yeah. in so many ways. That diamond crash in 82, that was a fundamental moment in this team's history. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. If you look at the total lifetime accident history of the Thunderbirds, it is about a 10% loss rate for the pilots on the team. You look at the accident history of the Blue Angels, it's almost exactly the same. Same thing with major accidents, Class A mishaps. Approximately 25% of Thunderbird and Blue Angel pilots have been in a Class A mishap. It's just that difficult. There are no buffers on these demonstrations. They really are that close. They really are that low to the ground, and they really are that dependent on the blind trust between formation members. That's just an interesting kind of macro view. You asked about parallels between the T-38 era, into the early 80s and today. There are a lot. In fact, if you go back, let's zoom way, way, way out. There's a speech that President Carter gave in 1979 called The Crisis of Confidence. If anyone has not heard it or read it or listened to it, I'd encourage you to look it up because it is absolutely fascinating. You talk about cycles in cultural history. Listen to some of these things that he talked about. You had just come out of a failed war in Vietnam. You had a 10-foot tall giant adversary that the United States just didn't think it could compete with. It was the USSR. You had spiraling inflation. You had a reinvigoration of self-promotion and self-interest in American culture. And Carter talks about that. In 1979, he talks about self-indulgence, self-promotion. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Yeah, look at today. We just came out of Afghanistan. We've got a 10-foot tall giant adversary in China that we think is amazing. We've got spiraling inflation, and we've got a reinvigoration of self-promotion. And so these cultural waves, when you look back at that diamond crash and what the team had to do to rebuild from that diamond crash, that low point, we'll call it, in history, I think it's a direct parallel to what the team had to do starting really about 3 years ago in the pandemic era. And that pandemic era allowed us to start that control, delete, and cultural reset that it is working. And I'll send you another picture of that same maneuver so you can show both the 2022 Diamond Pass and Review versus the one that's been online for about the last 2 decades.